Paul's book has helped teach us what we should be looking for. And in London, we have an extraordinary diversity of trees. I'm just going to say one thing about the festival. It's run by volunteers. Everyone's donated their time for free. The panelists, the people who are running it in the background. It's had to go virtual, but that's been a lovely thing in many ways. But if anyone can donate to the Urban Tree Festival to help pay for this, that would be very, very welcome indeed. There'll be links in the chat on the side, but also links about where to buy Paul's books. Paul and I are going to talk for about 30 minutes, I imagine. You can then ask Paul questions at the end, but just write them down whenever you like. They'll be fielded in the chat, either by me or by Erica. So, welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Paul, I'm also going to say at this point, has been probably the main force, or one of them, behind the Urban Tree Festival. But the main question, Paul, is whether you believe in nominative determinism.
Well,
your name, Paul Wood, is obviously highly suggestive. When did you first become interested in trees?
Well, that's a very good question, and I suppose I've been interested in trees all my life, but I only realised that nominative determinism was a thing, I suppose, when the first edition of London Street Trees came out, and it became apparent that this interest in trees, which was second nature to me, became a public thing, because I must admit I always thought that it was a very solitary interest, and apart from my friends and family, very few people knew that it was something I was interested in, and I'd never pursued it professionally or anything like that. It was just whenever we were on country walks or anything, I'd be able to tell people things about the trees and so on. And I suppose about, must have been about 9 or 10 years ago, I was been working in the technology industry for many years, and in the sort of marketing and technology and advertising. And I felt that the things that I were interested in were not really given much ability to come through in the world. So I started a blog called thestreettree.com, which had a few followers, not very many, but one of them was a small publisher who approached me and said that he'd, in his life as a publisher, he'd always wanted to publish a book about street trees, and would I be interested in writing it? And I said, of course. I felt I could never really, I couldn't feel like anybody else would be able to, perhaps, or that I would probably be really regretted if I said no to it. And never having written a book before, I thought this is quite an interesting and daunting project. So, but I jumped at it and enjoyed it.
It must have taken an awfully long time to write. The book itself, London Street Trees, which is now in its second edition, but it's packed full of information, but it's also would have involved you travelling around most of London.
That's true, yes. So I suppose to give you a bit of background, I started writing it about 2015. The first edition came out in 2017. And I realised pretty soon that I needed to do a lot of research, because I didn't know quite as much as perhaps I thought I might. And one of the things which I always think about is I live in Islington in North London, and there was the street that I live on, there was this enormous tree at the end of it, and I had no idea what it was. And it took me 2 years to work out that this was a Caucasian wingnut, which is a very unusual tree. And now that I sort of see them everywhere in Islington, but it's interesting because you don't really see them elsewhere. They're an Islington speciality. And that's a sort of fascinating thing which I discovered while researching the book, is that each area of London is very different compared to others. And because of the trees. So the trees almost determine the character of a part of London, because it's all done at a local authority level. But yeah, I kind of found that a very interesting and fascinating research project. I was also at a point in my career where what I've been doing for a long time was coming to an end, and it was a sort of perfect project to transition from working in a sort of corporate world into a more sort of consultant, freelance, stroke, gig economy world, which is the one I find myself in now.
Yes, don't we all? So you pounded the streets basically, and why are different boroughs different from each other? Why are different trees planted in different boroughs?
Well, I guess it's because each local authority has the responsibility for managing and maintaining trees in their patch, and over many years, different people come and go with different passions and different interests, and different budgets are given to it as well. So you'll see that in some boroughs in London, particularly, that tree planting hasn't been high on the priority list. Maybe it's not, or historically hasn't really been seen as a effective use of money compared with more pressing social and education and health and all these other things which you feel your council tax is probably very useful or very well used for. But I guess currently, or in the last few years, the whole environmental agenda has meant that trees, or the benefits of trees, have become to be valued financially as well. And therefore, I think local authorities are beginning to realise that this is something which is worth putting money into, and something which is actually a vote winner as well.
Yeah, you have a lot to say about, you have a lot of praise for Hackney Council in the book, whereas others, you say, I mean, they don't plant as many trees, but also their planting policy is quite dreary. So what's so great about Hackney? What have they been doing in Hackney?
Well, I guess I used to live in Hackney, and this was about 20 years ago, and Hackney was relatively unplanted in those days. And when I was researching the book, as you were saying, I was pounding the streets. So I was kind of, going all over London. And it was a very exciting time because I would walk around the streets and suddenly see these amazing trees, and some of which I didn't know what they were. So I was learning a lot and discovering all these new things. And going back to Hackney, having lived there previously, I suddenly noticed that it had all been planted in the last 20 years. And it had this incredibly diverse tree flora lining the streets. And as I sort of dug into that, I discovered it was pretty much the work of one man, Rupert, who is acknowledged in the book. And Rupert is the tree officer in Hackney and has been for a long time. And he was sort of given the political sort of, the politicians in Hackney were able to say, yes, we want to put some money into this and give Rupert the opportunity to get on with what he wants to do. So they don't interfere. They allow him to do what he does best. And within the sort of community of tree officers and so on, they come from different backgrounds. So some of them come from what you might think of as a sort of what might be called an arborist background, where as younger people, they may have spent a lot of time climbing up trees with chainsaws, and they sort of come into that very much from a functional point of view. But I think some come from much more of a sort of plantsman point of view and are interested in the sort of peculiarity of trees and the rarity and the diversity which their role essentially allows them to exploit. And I don't know whether anybody was on the Tree Rings webinar we had yesterday with Andy Tipping, who's a tree officer in Barnet, and he similarly has an interest in plants. So Hackney isn't the only borough. I just think that it's very dramatic how it's been planted because it was so underplanted, and in a sense they were given, there was a huge palette with which to or a huge canvas on which to paint.
Just do you know roughly how many trees have been planted in Hackney in recent years compared to other boroughs? Is it dramatically more?
I wouldn't know about that, to be honest, but I'd say it probably is dramatically more, and it's probably thousands that they've planted. And I know that Hackney have a plan to plant another 5,000 in the next 5 years, which is really significant. I think one of the things I talk about in the book is the example of Bermondsey and Ada Salter, who was the mayor
Ada
there.
Salter, yes.
Yeah, and she planted 7,000 trees in around about a 10-year period from a borough which had virtually no trees and probably no street trees whatsoever.
That's Bermondsey, yes.
Yeah, and Bermondsey obviously isn't a borough anymore. It's been swallowed up into Southwark, but you can still sort of trace the borders of Bermondsey by the trees that were planted.
She had a particular tree she liked.
She did, the Tree of Heaven, and you can trace the boundaries of that former borough by the Tree of Heaven, which was Ada Salter's favourite tree. It's it's an attractive tree, and I think it's a politician's favourite because it grows very fast. And if you're on a short-term political career, having a tree which delivers results quickly, I think is something you probably want to plant.
Yes, it doesn't live very long though. Similarly, no.
That's true.
You said, which was really interesting to me. You said London was late to street trees compared to other cities. Why was that? Do you know? Or
well, I think I suppose just to give you a very brief history of street tree planting or modern street tree planting, what we think of as street trees, didn't really start in London until about 1870 when the embankment was planted, when that was basil jets and they connected with the great sewer and the great stink which preceded it, and the embankment was built, and tree pits were engineered into that structure, which allowed the planting of trees, and that followed the example of Paris. So Haussmann's redevelopment of Paris in the earlier 19th century and the Grand Boulevards included trees planted along them, and that was the model which London followed. But there'd been a lot of debate before that about should we plant them, and there was a lot of resistance to it. A lot of people felt that they would get in the way, but the embankment was an overnight success, both as a place to be seen and to see other people. So it became this promenade. It didn't have a roadway at that point. So that was, and the trees were an integral part of that. And of course, those were London planes, probably not called London planes at that time, but that started the trend.
Is that when the London plane became the iconic London tree?
I think so. I mean, we nicked it from Paris, as we did many things at that time, and it would have been called the hybrid plane at that time. But after the success of the embankment, lots of other parts of London wanted to follow suit, so they planted this same urban tree that was the Parisian plane, and they were following the example of London. So London's example became the English-speaking exemplar, and therefore the name London plane was added at that point, or London was appended to the plane, and exported all over the English-speaking world.
As the London plane.
Yeah, it's not called the London plane in Paris, though.
No, we just nicked it. I like the fact you said in the book that there's a class element to our street plantings. Why is that?
Well, historically, certainly, I think that's less so. But I think going back to that period, and a good example is Muswell Hill, actually, which is a very leafy part of North London that was built and planted around the turn of the 19th century. So between 1899 and 1904, 1905. And it was laid out as a very aspirational place to live, and trees were very much part of the mix at that point. And so trees were very much seen as part of what it meant to live in a grand area. So the grander your boulevard, the grander the trees.
Right.
And I think the quote is from Harold Dioecious, who wrote a book about Camberwell, actually, in the 1960s. He was a sociologist, and he used a quote of, I'm paraphrasing, but it was planes and horse chestnuts for the grand boulevards and unadorned macadam for the working classes. And that has all been, turned on its head now, but you can still see the legacy of that. And, you see parts of East and Southeast London where there are still streets which have no trees on them, and local authorities are, battling to get the money and to plant those trees.
Yes, it's bewildering, a street with no trees. You write a little bit about native and non-native species. I realise this is more of a question for the wilder countryside, but nonetheless, it's an issue that exercises some people about whether we should be planting more native trees on our streets. And London is spectacularly diverse when it comes to its trees. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a really it's a question which comes up a lot, and I often get asked it when I'm leading walks and doing talks and so on. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that the city is a very unnatural habitat, and it's the built environment. It has a very different climate to the natural environment outside the city. So, there's a thing called the urban heat island effect, where the concrete, glass, steel of buildings and roads, etc., soaks up the heat during the day and releases it at night. And that can mean that the temperature in a city is 10 degrees higher, particularly at night, than it is in the outside. So that means that we need to think about different types of trees that will thrive in that habitat. And someone told me, London, the climate in London is more akin to the Rhodope Mountains in northern Greece than the Essex countryside, for instance.
Sounds lovely.
Yes.
But nonetheless, one of the aspects is native trees do bring more biodiversity, in that they support more insect life, more bird life.
They do, and I think there's a very good argument to plant native trees, and many tree planters in London will be planting lots of native trees. And I know some boroughs will have they will specify that 50% of the trees that are planted are native. But non-native trees can have be equally beneficial. So, for instance, the horse chestnut, non-native, very good for bees. The sycamore, it's a controversial tree, but it supports an incredible amount of wildlife. Lots of thorns and other rosaceous species, which are flowering trees, will be great for insects. And then I think there's also the question of, what do we want our street trees for? Do we want them to, because one of the things which is always levelled against the London Plain, of course, is that it's not a native tree, it supports very little wildlife. But what it does do is reduce pollution and oxygenate the air more so than most other species, because it's such a large tree and has such large leaves and such a big canopy. So I think that there's lots of nuanced questions which need to be asked around that question. But I certainly have sympathy for planting more native trees, and there's certainly some which I think we should see more of, like the hornbeam.
I love the hornbeam. Yes, I was fascinated to see that, which I hadn't realised until recently, we seem to plant mainly male trees around the world.
Yes, that's certainly true in parts of North America, and it's something which it's become a bit of a story recently, yes. And it's a kind of, I think it's quite fun, but the reality of trees is that there are not very many species that are dioecious, which means that they have separate male and female plants. Most are monoecious, which means that they have both male and female flowers, or male and female flowering parts on the same tree. But the argument of this dioecious planting is that if you plant male trees, all that pollen gets into the air, all that male pollen, with no females to attract it, and that can cause particularly allergy sufferers a great deal of discomfort. And the primary culprit is the ginkgo, which is a tree not unusual in London, and that is planted. I mean, I sort of kind of disagree with this really, but the received wisdom is that you plant male ginkgos because they don't bear the fruit that female ones do. Female ginkgos produce a fruit. It's not actually a fruit, it's a fruit-like body that when it falls in the autumn, it has an enormously powerful smell, which is appalling. And of course, But then I think you have to weigh up the difference between the effect of hay fever sufferers at one time of year who are affected by the male pollen and the effect to the general population of smelly fruit. And my personal opinion is that we should have more of both.
Right. What is your favourite tree, Paul?
Oh,
A
gosh.
species and an individual. You knew this question would come.
Well, yes, and it's one that I always prepare myself for mentally, but I always
Yeah.
don't know the answer. And I suppose the truth is it changes constantly. I have no one favorite tree that I could say at any time of the year, this is my favorite tree. It's seasonal, I'm afraid.
Right,
So
go on then. So you can have 4.
Well, I'm afraid I am. Yeah, it's a terrible. I can't make up my mind either. So at the moment, I'd say it's the London Plane. I kind of find them,
lovely.
Yeah, magnificent. They sort of define London. But in sort of March and April, it's the prunus species, all the cherries, which I just love, and I can't. Every year, I try to learn 2 or 3 more because I still don't know what they all are. And there are others. I know
there's a lovely, you write
that,
about, there's an avenue, isn't there, or a street, which has its very own Japanese cherry blossom festival every year because they planted only that particular tree on the street.
Yes. Yeah, that's Winterbrook Road in the Herne Hill. And it's been planted with Yoshino cherries, which I think are the most beautiful of the cherries. And it's a Japanese cultivar like many, but it's the tree it's the cherry variety that you'll find in Japan, most widely planted, but it's fairly rare in the UK. Winterbrook Road was planted by it was instigated by a former councillor called Robin, and she grew up in Washington DC, where there are grand avenues of these trees that have been given to the city by Tokyo. And so after the Second World War, they were planted and Washington DC is famous for its Yoshino avenues. And she said, when she became a councillor in South London, let's plant a Yoshino avenue. And she was able to galvanise the community and the tree officers on the council to be able to do that. And it's just maturing nicely now, and it's absolutely stunning. In fact, the cover of the book is a picture of one of those Yoshino cherries.
There's a beautiful photograph inside the book as well, the avenue itself. Did I interrupt you? Did you have more than 2 favourite trees? Were you going to give us a?
Well, I was going to explain. Yes. Well, you said 4, so I'm giving myself 4, if you don't mind. So the beech tree is always a great favourite of mine. A very rare street tree, and I grew up with a beech tree, so I always have a particular love for those. And in the book, I say that the wild service tree is my favourite, which it sort of is at times. So there you go. There's 4.
That's brilliant. So the beech tree is an example of a tree that, and I'm thinking in terms of Sheffield right now, is a tree which has very shallow roots and can disrupt the pavement. And in Sheffield, they ran into all sorts of difficulties because the council subcontracted to a private company and started chopping down all their street trees because they were messy and in the way. Are our street trees adequately protected, do you think?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question, that, and I think that the fact is that the people who manage and look after the trees are the same people who have the power of deciding when they should go. I mean, in Sheffield, though, what happened was that was all outsourced to a private contractor, and you can see the logic. A private contractor is wanting to increase its margins, can see all these very old, beautiful trees, which represent huge management costs. So to avoid the management costs, cut down the trees. And obviously there was a huge backlash there, but that has happened in the past in other places. And I think we're just, maybe in the time of people noticing trees more. Social media, I'm sure, has a lot to do with it, where the campaigns to protect those trees and protect what people value have gained enough momentum to stop that happening. And now I think any local authority would look at the example of Sheffield and never allow that to happen.
Yes, that's an optimistic thought, and let's hope so.
It is.
I've noticed another question is during lockdown, here we are, and we're all meant to be noticing nature more and our nearest trees. And it's true, we're spending a lot of time in the local area. I rather obsessively notice my local trees anyway. But are you optimistic about what the effect of lockdown?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose I think the thing which I hope will continue is that all the things that we've noticed and the changes that we've made will want to continue in some way after lockdown. I suppose that's the thing that could be positive in many ways, way beyond just trees. But I suppose that trees is something that many of us have noticed, or many people I think have noticed in more detail than before, perhaps. And particularly in London, I think we've all been aware that pollution has been much less. We've not had the planes flying over. We've had time to notice things. We've had time to go out. And I think that if we value those now and can remember that, why we valued them, maybe there's some hope there. But, as I see the lockdown is beginning to be loosened, I live very close to a main road, and it's just getting absolutely back to normal in terms of the amount of traffic on it.
Yes, it was always a fond hope, but there was a mile-long queue with engines running for our local garden centre 2 days ago. So who knows? Yes, there's some questions popping up on the side, which I might sort of interleave with in case I lose them, which I might interleave with my questions. But there's also a point here from Diana O'Riordan, who has said that, which is true, parking in front of narrow terraced houses means that front gardens have disappeared and most of the curbs have been replaced by letdowns, leaving no place for trees. We have just 8 small trees in the whole road.
Yeah, I mean, that's that's certainly something I've seen a lot of, particularly in the outer boroughs. And I think that, if you go up to places like Barnet and Totteridge, and which is something I mentioned in London is a Forest, you see that front gardens disappear and become parking for cars. And obviously those driveways in which you drive your Nissan or BMW into are required by the residents. But I think in more central parts of London, almost the opposite has occurred, in that local authorities have kind of made it more and more difficult to have a car, in the sense that, it's almost become socially unacceptable to have more than one car, or indeed one car even. Certainly where I live, the increasing controlled parking zones, the cost of driving into London, and all of that kind of stuff, and the how good public transport is, it means that you're incentivized not to have a car, and that's very beneficial. And I think in some parts of London that's happened. I'm hopeful that could happen elsewhere, but I realise that it's more of a societal issue rather than an issue of trees. I'm sure we'd all love to have more trees on the street, but I kind of think it's more to do with how do you incentivize people to get out of cars and not be so bound to having cars.
Yes. Do you not come across people who don't like trees? I do. Street trees, they complain about them, they're messy, they get in the way, they trip over them, they drop branches on their cars, their aphids pour crap all over their roofs, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a vocal minority who dislike trees, and I think that we have to consider how trees are, how we value trees as a society. But one of the funniest ones I heard was someone complaining to one of the local authorities where I knew someone, and they were telling me that they wanted the tree to be cut down because it was full of birds who were singing, making this terrible noise. And it sort of seemed like the singing of birds was far worse than the noise of traffic. I just couldn't understand that. But,
yeah, it's mind-boggling, but it exists.
Yeah.
We're getting in the chat. We're getting fans of the London plane tree are surfacing. You'll be very pleased to hear.
Ah, yeah.
And in fact, they do provide habitat. Someone's rightly pointing out, as well as having survived the Blitz with shrapnel in them. They have habitat for bats, birds, fungus, etc. Fungus, I've certainly heard. They're
That's
very good
true.
for that.
Yeah, and certainly birds like nesting in the high canopies. So perhaps not the most popular bird, but magpies like London planes, as do feral pigeons. But they don't support the insect life that an oak or a hornbeam does.
Are you a fan of the oak as a street tree?
Yeah, I said,
Quite a bold choice. Not
yes,
in a narrow street, I imagine.
Well, there is the cypress oak or the Costa oak, which is a fastigiate form, which is the narrow form, and that's been tried out in some parts of London. I rather like it, and it would work in those sorts of areas. There was always the perception was that oak wouldn't survive on streets, but I've seen them thriving pretty well. There's one outside Charing Cross Station, in fact, and another one outside Pimlico Station, and they both seem to do very well. So I think that the wisdom which has sort of said that these trees are not suitable is being challenged, and we can start seeing them planted more frequently.
Do you think that's because the nature of pollution is changing? Maybe the London smog, I think, was decided that was very detrimental to oak trees. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think it is the nature of pollution has changed.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I wanted to know is what we should be worried about in terms of street trees generally. Are they going to be new threats? Is it just diseases, climate change?
Pests and diseases, I think, is the main one, because in our increasingly globalized world, pests and diseases move more freely and more frequently. Climate change means that diseases that might have affected trees in more southerly locations will migrate further north, and that's certainly the case with the plane tree disease, which I've suddenly forgotten the name of, which is coming up from southern Europe, which was imported from North America during the Second World War, so that's a threat. Climate change is compounding that. But then I think on a more sort of prosaic level, there's things like how will cities change in the future in terms of things like car ownership, how we travel around cities, infrastructure connected to 5G networks, and how do we need more things on more street furniture and things like that. My vision for a future city would be that there is less, individual car use, perhaps, and we would have greater space for trees, and we could sort of, take back some of the road to plant with trees. You already see it, build outs into roads where a parking space is taken up by a tree, which wouldn't have been there otherwise because the pavements would be too narrow. More of that, I think, would be a good thing.
Are there any cities that are doing that well that you're aware of?
I think lots of cities are doing things very well. I was in the Netherlands last year, and I thought I was in Eindhoven. I was very impressed by how they separate out bike lanes and tram lanes and car lanes, and have very large street trees. But that's a sort of master planning thing, which is to do with a much more modern city. Of course, London has the legacy of being a very old city that doesn't have that opportunity, I suppose. So we're going to have to work with it. But I think London does pretty well in terms of green space generally. We have, a great deal of our canopy cover is something like 23%, and the number of trees in London equates to the number of people. It's about 8.5 million. So on that level, we're not bad, I think. Could do better.
Yes, B+ query. It's kicking off in the sidebar. We probably have another 5 or 6 minutes, but there's someone having a go. Callum Henderson's having a go at the hornbeam here, which is offending me. Hornbeams are boring and only natural to a small corner of Kent. It only has
Well,
16 species associated with it, and these will not be found in all parts of the UK. Paul, I
well,
think you're a fan of the hornbeam, aren't you?
well, I am, yeah, and I disagree with that because I'd say that London is slap bang in the middle of the Hornbeam belt, which goes from sort of North Kent through southern Essex, and Middlesex would be the sort of heart of that. So I think they're very much native to London, and in fact, all the ancient woodlands in London are full of hornbeams. And I know that a survey in the City of London, they were looking at biodiversity within trees in the city. And, you know, you have to recognize that this is a very unnatural environment, and it's not going to have the same biodiversity supported as you would in a native woodland. But a hornbeam was found to have greater number of other species associated than English oak trees in the city. So I think that it's much more suited to life in the city.
That's a very interesting point, as well as it being a very elegant and beautiful tree, and its timber is so impressive. You write about that in your book, about how what happens to London trees or any street tree once its life is over.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. And actually, when I was researching the second edition, which is not, this is a sort of new thing to me, actually, is that came across Saunders Seasonings, which is a guy, Brian Saunders, I think his name. He lives he has a workshop in Walthamstow, and he basically produces timber from ex London street trees, and his favourite timber is London Plane, and it produces a fantastic wood which is known as lacewood, and it's very attractive, sort of shimmers like silk, but he was telling me what happened to most street trees, and it's bad, I'm afraid. So what
Right.
most local authorities are desperate to get rid of the street trees as soon as they've cut them down, because the sort of presence of sawn logs and things like that is not something which they want people to be particularly, they can get quite upset about. So generally things get chipped. And this includes big trees, which are, have potentially very valuable timber associated with them. So London plane trees generally end up as wood chips, as do virtually every other tree. And there are lots of unusual species which, inevitably have to come down. Hornbeam produces fantastic timber, and the Saunders Seasoning chap was telling me that his favourite was Norway maple, in fact, which is the second most frequent street tree in London.
Is it? Oh.
Apparently so.
So, yes, if anyone's got any questions, ask away. There's one here. Outside of London, even outside the UK, are there street tree organisations that you think are noteworthy or particularly effective?
Yeah, well, I think, we should probably look abroad for how those things are managed, and I think North America is very good at this because they've had less of a kind of culture, I suppose, of authorities kind of paying for these types of things. So there's the Friends of the Urban Forest in San Francisco, who basically look after all the trees there. There's a blog piece on our website where there's an interview. I interviewed Nicola Woods, who's in Toronto.
Another Woods.
She's a Woods. She's a plural. I'm a singular. So we're unrelated. But she was originally from Sheffield, actually, and emigrated to Toronto. But it's very involved in an organisation there called LEAF. And I think that all sorts of NGOs operate particularly in North American cities. Every big US city has NGOs. I was on a Zoom call the other day with people in New York who are really showing the way forward for these types of things. So they have all sorts of public programs to educate people and get them involved in maintaining and watering trees. It's beginning to happen here. I think the benchmark here is Street Trees for Living in Lewisham, who are taking that on. Yeah, right. They're a fantastic organisation. And of which I'm just become the patron of, so maybe I've got a bit of interest there. But they really worth looking up. They're raising money.
In Deptford? There's a Deptford organisation.
Deptford Folk as well, yeah.
Deptford Folk, yes.
Yeah, and they planted 200 trees for the anniversary of the publication of John Evelyn's diary, of course, a famous ex-Deptford resident. It's his 400th anniversary of his birth this year, so they're hoping to plant 400 trees for that.
Amazing, amazing. So, Paul, what street trees does London not have? What street trees should we have? What's missing?
Well, in the book, I sort of pulled out a few, and I think that one of the things we have to think about is climate change, and there are certainly going to be new ones that appear over the coming years as we look at how we're going to have to build in resilience. So one of the trees which is very overplanted in London, I think, is the rowan, which really doesn't thrive. It's a native tree, it provides great biodiversity, but it barely lasts for 15 or 20 years. It doesn't really reach maturity. It's much more suited to a northern mountainside than a London street. But there is a relative of that, the true service tree, Sorbus domestica, which looks like a big rowan, would last a lot longer. There's examples in squares and gardens in London, but there's none on the street. And I think that would be a great tree to plant as a street tree.
I love the fact that you get very excited when you find a tree on a street you haven't come across before. Have you got spies out across London keeping you informed, or do you just happen to walk everywhere?
Well, I do a lot of walking around, I have to say, but I increasingly have spies, I suppose, and when there tend to be Twitter followers who, there's a network of people on Twitter that share sort of unusual tree finds, and I'm an avid recipient of those, and also people send me requests for identifying things every now and again, which I encourage, I must say. I kind of quite like that. And also Rupert, who's the tree officer in Hackney, tends to occasionally drop me emails to tell me what he's planted. So
yes. So we're almost done, Paul. My last question is on a more sort of writing question. So do you have favourite nature writers? Was there anyone who inspired you in particular?
Yeah, well, I suppose nature writing is sort of one of those things which as you can imagine, I've always been reading the sort of factual tomes rather than the more sort of poetic or romantic ones, because I've sort of been craving the information. And from that point of view, I think the writer which I've most admired is Oliver Rackham. I mean, I don't think he's a particularly... they're difficult to read from cover to cover, but his insights into why things are, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And he's a sleuth in terms of understanding how ecosystems work. And he, certainly reading his book, answers a lot of, or reading his multiple books, answers a lot of the questions which I've always asked myself about how woods function and how certain things happen to be in woods. And I found those fascinating. And another one I'd say is W.G. Hoskins and the Making of the English Landscape.
Yes.
was a sort of seminal book for me, because it sort of explains how the whole landscape has been developed, and how that has developed into cities, and how things like road layouts have occurred. So when you think of sort of, streets of terraced housing, Victorian houses in London, they basically follow field patterns. So the street pattern of London reflects what was there before. And in some parts of London, particularly southeast London, you get to find trees that were part of those fields before the streets, which have still been maintained or retained on the streets. And I always think that's an amazing thing to see. So those two, I think, are from that kind of factual thing. Richard Maybe, very interesting. And I think, who else would I recommend? Peter Fiennes, of course. Oak and Ash and Thorn is a great book, and
yes,
that's worth looking into. Kate Stafford's, I have it behind me, I'm sure. The Long, Long Life of Trees. I kind of like biographies and things. So I also was thinking about Jenny Uglow's biography of Thomas Bewick, the great illustrator of birds. It's a very interesting book.
There's so much nature writing there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of struggle with a lot of it, I must say. I kind of have struggled with that. I think Luke Turner touched on this, that, you know, the single male surveying, you know, I've never wanted to do that, or never been interested in describing what I see or what I'm feeling. And I very much purposely wrote London is a Forest from third person perspective, rather than a sort of first person sense of what it meant to me. It was more about what is it and how do we understand it. But then on the other hand, London Street Trees is an opinionated guidebook, I suppose.
It's a very personal book, but it's a brilliant book. I'm going to have to stop you there, Paul, but it's a fabulous book. Everyone should buy London Street Trees. It's in its second edition now. Here's, again, London is a Forest. I think you can find information about where to get them. I'm going to have to stop there, Paul. Thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions as well. Sorry I haven't had a chance to read them all, but hopefully you'll get to see the chat afterwards. And
you will.
If there's anything that anybody wants to follow up, get in touch through my website or Twitter.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.